And saying, hope you're doing great. First, FR and AFN. As we were doing quite a few sessions towards career guidance and career path guidance, today we are going to talk about fraud investigation and ethical related matters. And here we have guest with us, CA Priyanka Ji, but not Priyanka Gandhi. One more PG from my side. We are friends from college, so I know for a long way out. We'll not spend too much time. So she has also been rank holder. I think I would say me like her or her like me. I don't know, but we share common things that way. And after becoming a CA, she has moved into this line, and I think more than 10, 15 years now she's in this line. So I think she has she'll be able to guide better on how to take matter on these related things. So I think you take over. You can just tell about your journey so far, and then we can have the Q&A session afterwards.
Sure, Chinmaya. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. Just before I get started, I think there's a bit of technical glitch. Your voice is breaking when you speak. Could we just check that?
Can we, who are joining online, can just confirm if my voice is clear and voice is audible? Anybody who can, if you can comment, it will be helpful. Yeah, I think my voice is breaking. You can just speak for 1 minute.
Yes,
Let
sure.
us see whether.
Yes, thank you so much for having me here, and it's a pleasure to be here. Years back, and here we are today.
So when you're doing articleship itself, you got a sense of how these things would work, is it?
Yes, yes. So in fact, when we're looking at our career, the way the articleship choices are either, people do it with the Big Four, where you get a very specific and specialized exposure, which is either in the audit department or internal audits, or there's also risk advisory opportunities. Or there are much smaller firms where, of course, they're exposed to more of tax-related work, and there are, where they're sort of running a lot of different projects for them. But then there are these mid-sized firms, and today we have so many of them, where then when you're doing articleship, you're not sort of constrained to any specific field. You can do multiple sources. And that is when, interestingly, I got exposed to internal audits, process reviews. We did very specific forensic investigations. Actually, that was quite lucky that as an article, I got exposed to forensic investigations, which is not a very common thing to happen. So that is where my interest picked up in this field.
That's great. I was fortunate enough to get into that. Great. So how do you find the difference between regular accounting and forensic accounting, if at all, if there is any difference?
Of course, there is a lot of difference between traditional accounting and forensic accounting. See, let's take example of our health, right? So what do we do to maintain our health? You do certain preventive things, then there are certain monitoring aspects that you do, and then there are certain detective things. For example, you eat right, get the right nutrition, take supplements. All these are preventive things where you're trying to improve your health or keep it well. Then there are monitoring activities, which is mostly where you go and get a health checkup done. You monitor your health, you make sure your health is in the right place. Then there are detective ways, right? That suppose when something goes wrong, then you go and run some lab tests, or you're trying to figure out what exactly is wrong with your health, which goes into a bit of forensic and detective mode. So if we were to draw parallel to an organizational financial health, traditionally, we have seen that preventive and monitoring have been around for a long time now. Now, preventive roles, which we see typically in chartered accountants, can be of in the finance department or a controllership role. And then you have financial analysis and planning. All these roles have been quite traditional, and these are very important in sustaining and maintaining the health of a financial health of an organization. And then evolved the monitoring rules, which are mostly around audits. Now you have internal audits, statutory audits, you have risk advisory, or multiple, whole bunch of things around that. But obviously, as time evolved, we also moved to a bit of a detective controls based, where when something goes wrong or when there is a suspicion that something is going wrong, then you need a forensic expert or forensic audit to be done, which is going much deeper than a regular audit and seeing what has actually gone wrong. So these are broadly the differences between traditional versus forensic audit and accounting roles.
So to do an audit, only a CA can do, and there are many things that CAs only offer to do. Is there anything like that forensic audit is to be done by a CA or any of, and it just happened to be a group of CAs that will do it?
Yes.
How does that look like?
So, see, in forensic audits, it is not attesting to a certain set of financial statements, or you're not signing off of anything, right? So, forensic audits are more of checking controls, of gathering evidences, and then submitting your findings on what actually went wrong. So, there is no requirement that it has to be a chartered accountant. But having said that, typically in forensic audits, you have to analyze financial statements. You need to follow the money trail many times. You need to understand what are the entries that have gone and how the books have been maintained, right? So a CA is in a very strong position to do these activities. But there is also quite a bit of legal aspect to be looked at, because when you're talking about a fraud or a violation, it is a combination of a accountant and a legal professional, I would say. So as an accountant goes on, they also pick up certain legal and compliance related skills. So yes, there is no legal requirement that it has to be a CA or not a CA or a lawyer, but it would definitely be a strong case to have a chartered accountant participate in this forensic audit.
Okay. So, and we also have seen in movies that there are forensic laboratories when a typical event happens or murder happens. We have seen in movies, at least for me. Is there anything like that, or like you go to a particular place, or you have a particular tool, or any method available involving these things?
Okay, okay. So yes, what you see in movies, the forensic laboratories, those are more biological related laboratories, right? And
Correct.
or chemical related laboratories where they're testing certain things. So I'll talk about how forensics work in our accounting world. I'll talk what are the different branches which are there and how a typical investigation takes place, right?
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So forensic, typically for us as chartered accountants, you have a core team, which is called as the investigations team, who run the primary investigations. That is, you are looking at the allegations and running the case end to end, right? So you are the main investigator. Okay. Now, to support that, you will have a data analysis expert whenever there is large volume of data. This sometimes can be the same person, or you can have an additional expert who is looking at the data. So we have the investigations, we have the data analysis wing, and then there is a forensic technology, which is mostly to do with your equipments, which are like laptops, mobile phones, or servers, any other technological equipments which are involved. And then you have a fourth wing, which is like a intelligence, where you're gathering external intelligence on the case. These are There are people who are actually on field, or there are people who are running background searches to gather information. So all these multiple, there are many more aspects, but I'm talking about the key aspects of investigations. So all these elements come together and tie to a forensic investigations. Now, this is not done in any secret lab and where there are keys and lock codes and passcodes. Investigations can happen across different regions, across different time and space. But yes, there is a very, very important need for confidentiality and maintaining data privacy and making sure that the investigations are carried out in a certain way, right? So there are aspects like chain of custody. How do we gather an evidence? How do you present an evidence? So these aspects do come into play. But yes, the work happens across different verticals, different sections. There are multiple individuals involved in a typical investigation.
Okay. And how does things start? Like, what does how does what does trigger? Like, is there any requirement that a forensic audit should happen, like, or the company decides, or there has to be a fraud happening, that then only an investigation starts, or there has to be a police case being filed and then investigation starts? So what really triggers the initiation of the forensic audit?
Mhm. Yeah, very interesting question. Okay, so if we talk about today as is, forensic audits are mostly detective in nature. There is some bit of preventive controls also which are there in forensic, but largely it is detective. It's like when something in our health goes wrong, only then we run to the labs and get some tests, right? I mean, it doesn't make sense to go every morning. I'll go get my blood checked, then every morning I'll go my heart rate checked. It doesn't work like that. So similarly, it's not that you're running forensic audits on a routine basis to check everything. No, typically, usually, what are some of the important triggers that will result in a forensic audit? So most of the corporations, companies today have a whistleblower hotline where people can report complaints. That is employees or vendors or any third parties. If they sense that something is non-compliant or there is a fraud which is going on in the organization, or they have to raise some concerns, so whistleblower hotlines are quite commonly available. Everybody is aware of that. So the complaints which are received in whistleblower hotlines become a very key source for starting a forensic audit. Then, apart from that, of course, management on their own, suo moto, if they have certain suspicions that something is not right with a certain division or with a certain process, they can also start investigations or give a mandate for a forensic audit to be started. Then you earlier we talked about preventive and monitoring controls, right? So when there are certain preventing and monitoring controls going on, that is, there are certain audits which are already happening. Some of the findings may indicate that something is not really right with the company. So based on that, a forensic audit can be started. So whenever there is a trigger that something is wrong, that is when a forensic audit happens. Right? There is no routine statutory requirement that every year you need to have a forensic auditor who visits and who signs off that there is no fraud in this organization. By the way, which can never happen. Nobody will ever sign off that, saying that there is no fraud, because we can investigate and we can find evidences, but that it cannot be that always that you can certify that there is no fraud. It's a very investigative and detective process to find these issues.
Yeah. And how do you define the boundaries? Because, for a statutory audit, there are specific guidelines, and for tax audit, there are reports format available, and they have to look at specific things. But fraud,
Right.
there is no boundaries, right? So when a assignment comes, and how the boundaries are decided, and what's the scope of work, basically.
Yes, yes. Okay. So there are typically a few steps which are quite common in any forensic audits or investigations. So first thing we start with is the what is the complaint? What is the allegation which is actually coming in? So we try and understand it in as much depth as possible. You talk to the whistleblower if possible, if they're not anonymous, because in many cases whistleblowers tend to be anonymous. But wherever we have access available, we definitely speak to the whistleblowers, right? So once you gather information around the allegations, then you understand them in depth. And after that is you start collecting documents and data around that. So you formulate your procedures, investigative procedures around the allegations. Suppose the allegation is that employee X is embezzling money out of a particular expense account or a bank account, right? Then you start looking at what are the documents and data available around that employee. When did he join the organization? How long has he been here? What are the different expense accounts he handles? What are the different bank accounts he handles? What is his role within the company? Who are the people he reports to? Who approves the transactions? I'm just giving an example. You logically go around the specific allegation and formulate procedures. So once you've formulated the procedures, basically that's when you gather as much documents, data, as much you talk to people, you interview people, you gather information. That is the information gathering phase. After that, once you review all the facts, you review all the elements, and you analyze what is actually the documents are saying. That is when you collect evidences out of it. Some of the pieces may make sense, some of them may not make sense. So you collect what makes sense and you see whether there are evidences to support the allegation, or it looks like it's just many times there are a lot of false allegations, right? We live in a world where people tend not to like each other. So there could be instances where false allegations are placed on each other. Or sometimes you just don't have enough supporting evidences. So you investigate, you gather data, you look at evidences. Once you have evidences, that is when then you interview the individuals who are involved and draw a conclusion to the whole forensic audit. By the way, when you talk of guidelines, yes, there are no boundaries, but ICI has issued certain standards which are specifically applicable for anybody who's doing a forensic audit. It talks about how an engagement should be structured, what are the key concepts in forensic audits, and how the steps have to be carried out. So there are certain standards which are issued by ICA in India.
Yeah, because now in the CA final syllabus, they have introduced something called as elective subjects. But in the elective, it was compulsory. Now they made something like a SPOM, self-paced online module. So you have to write exams online, but the marks will not come in mark sheet. And one of the subjects available is forensic auditing. So accounting, accounting auditing, one of them is introduced.
Auditing,
Maybe there they would have included many more points as issued by ICI.
Yes, there are standards. There are basically standards issued. They're not as exhaustive as accounting standard, of course, because they're quite recent in the past few years. But there are some indicative guidelines and standards issued by ICA for forensic audits.
Okay. Are there typical things which you look at, or can you give some examples where in your experience or even in general, like, these are the things which have red flags or what contributed frauds? Just to give an idea, something like whenever a fraud happens, and as an auditor point of view, I observed that there is a sales being cooked up to show more profit, and whenever you show more sales, the debtor will not show up because either it has to be credit side or cash sales. So is there anything something like that where you have seen in your experience or typical fraud being happening and you have observed in the real life situation?
Okay. First of all, fraudsters are smart. Okay. In so many organizations, especially, there is something called studying the profile of a fraudster. Okay. Who is a typical fraudster? So if you look at it, there are actually white papers and reports. Interested students can look it up later. How old are these individuals? What is their age group? How long have they been with the company? So these are quite experienced people in the company, also quite young, not too old, but not too inexperienced. And they are some of the star performers, know the processes quite well. They're very smart, very intelligent, and usually everybody is shocked that this is the person who's committed a fraud, So yes, there are certain typical characteristics of a fraudster, but there are also some repeated red flags which are quite important to note. Whenever there's a fraud, some of examples. One thing is the transactions have become quite complicated and complex. It will not be a straightforward, simple entry. They will try and layer it because they are smart. Like I said, they are smart, they're intelligent, they don't want to get caught. So it is not like I steal cash and I pass one single entry to cover it up. No, they will route the entries through at least 5 to 6 accounts and then they will layer it. So sometimes the more complex the transactions are, there is a higher chance of fraud because the fraudsters are smart enough not to keep it transparent. So complex and layered transactions. Then sometimes transactions can happen through multiple group companies. How actually money trail is being moved. When if you see large scale embezzlements, it will never happen at one company level. There will be paper companies where they'll be moved to multiple subsidiaries, and that subsidiaries will pay to another subsidiary. Then it goes back to parent company, and the third entity will get involved, and it can be even international transactions. So usually when you try and see, there is a lot of complex back and forth movements happening. That is another red flag which we have seen. Then poor documentation. Whenever there are cases of frauds, they don't tend to maintain documents very well. They keep it quite minimum, and documentation is not very strong. So that is some of the important red flags. Having limited approvers. Sometimes the powers are concentrated between just, let's say, 2 or 3 individuals. One person is raising, and even if it's a high value transaction, let's say a second person can approve, and there is no proper corporate governance established. So limited powers between a few individuals is also a very important red flag to look out when you're looking at potential and possible frauds. Also looking at the conflict of interest related topics, that are there any conflicts between the people in decision making authority and the other third parties who are involved in the transactions. because when there are conflicts, there are higher chances of fraud again. So yes, there are many more, but these are some common themes on red flags which we see when it comes to frauds.
Okay, great. And since it's related to fraud and investigation, there would be also a criminology or the police things would be involved, right? Like there's also other agencies which should be done doing a parallel investigation or maybe together. So how does it work? Like, do you interact with them, or it does have any impact on your investigation, or do you take any data from them, or vice versa?
Okay. Okay. So there are two kinds of investigations. Okay. One is where it has gone through the legal route. That once you first let's talk about the internal investigations. So typically, if you're working as an internal compliance officer or investigations officer for any company, when the complaints come in, you have to do an internal investigation first. Without you typically don't involve the external authorities right away because you're not sure if the allegations are right or not right or what has happened. I'm talking about at a corporate level. We will talk about at the regulatory level later. So internally, you investigate the matter, you look at if the evidences are right and what is the supporting, what are some of the violations that have happened. Depending on the seriousness of the violations, then the resultant decision can be sometimes it can be a simple warning letter, or sometimes you would dismiss the person, the employee involved, or you take action against a vendor. You can blacklist the vendor when it is at a company level matter. But when there are much larger forensic reviews, larger investigations, where there are more serious violations, then typically you start the legal process that the companies will approach the police. Then an FIR has to be made. Then the lawyers are involved. So the investigation will also be taken through the legal route. So this is at a corporate level. Now you can also see that there are a lot of investigations in the public space, right, involving public sector banks, large listed companies, or other public figures. In such cases, what happens? Typically, the complaints happen first. Suppose somebody files a complaint to the CBI or a complaint is filed to the SFIO. SFIO is the Serious Fraud Investigation Office. And once the complaint is filed, they might appoint a external auditor. It can be experts like the Big Four or some of the other consulting firms. Then the investigation happens in parallel with the legal process. So it can happen in multiple ways depending on what the issue is and how large it is. Is it a private matter within a company, or is it a public matter involving public funds and entities? So based on that, yes, there is definitely a lot of work, where a lot of cooperation needed between legal and the police authorities as well as the investigators, the accountants, the consultants who investigate the matters.
Okay. Typically, how many entities in the world does do this fraud investigation or forensic accounting, forensic auditing part?
Okay, your voice
Just
broke again. Can you just repeat that? Your voice broke again.
typically in global, how many entities are into this forensic auditing?
Globally, there are several. See,
Okay,
earlier,
you are in India in context, just to get an idea of quantity. Like, are there any enough options for the people to pursue?
see, in India, I would say definitely, typically for fresher CAs who are interested in forensic, the most ideal way is there are consulting firms. Like I said earlier, the choices were limited to big fours, but today, if you see, several mid-sized firms are developing their own forensic practices, right? So those are still several in numbers, but not very high. It is not high, not as highly available as, let's say, a statutory audit or internal audit. It is still a niche. It is still a specialization. So if you talk in terms of quantity, it will never be as many as your traditional accounting roles or traditional financial roles. But for people with sufficient interest, there are growing opportunities. They can always apply to Big Four, other consulting firms to start their career with forensics. Once they have started, then they can move to industries where there are compliance roles and investigator roles. But it would be a great idea to start with consulting firms to start off as a career in forensics.
Okay. And we'll come to that career part again.
Sure.
And these days now, the talk of the town is, ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, and you were also mentioning earlier about data analysis being a separate
Data
wing or a
analysis.
role. So how do you see that, like, and also what a person should know? You can throw some light on the data analytics, AI, and the tools that anyone should be aware of.
Okay. So yes, of course, today we live in a complex world where there are so many transactions happening. Things are very complex. There are multiple regulatory requirements. Every transaction has to be monitored, which is virtually impossible for a human being to do, right? Even if we are running investigations, looking at documents, there are limitations to what we can do as humans. Uh, so especially when we talk about forensic audits, there are, let's say, financial crimes and non-financial crimes, financial aspects and non-financial aspects. So especially when we talk about financial aspects, because the sheer volume of transactions are so high, if you take a bank for an example, or any multinational company, they run hundreds and thousands of transactions every day. So the detective mechanism might become too late in that case to detect a fraud or detect a violation and act on it. That is when data analysis and artificial intelligence and having these sort of controls will be immensely helpful, because they can study the patterns. They can identify when there is a violation of a specific pattern or when some transactions do not match the required compliance levels. So you must be familiar that in banks there are large teams which focus on anti-money laundering, AML. Then there are large teams which focus on KYC, know your customers requirements. So a lot of these AML, financial transactions monitoring, happen through continuous monitoring system. So as AI gets developed, as more and more patterns are fed into this, the systems also can catch the exceptions that much faster. Once the exceptions are thrown out, then of course the investigators can step in and review and see if it is a genuine exception or a false exception, and work on that. Because then otherwise it becomes virtually impossible for human intervention to look at different cases, right? So that is where data analysis and of course artificial intelligence can help to analyze the more complex transactions, to help us focus in the limited areas where the forensic expert should be focusing, rather than trying to identify the focus areas. And like I said earlier, you see, fraudsters are very smart. They're not leaving behind evidences like how they were doing 20, 15, 20 years back. Nobody's writing an email saying, hey, let us embezzle this money. No, that's not happening.
Correct.
To catch hold of it, right? No, they're smart. They're not leaving records like they used to. I mean, believe me, earlier investigations, we have seen very, very interesting emails where they're very careless, where they're very reckless. They might write some things which they implicate themselves after that. But that's not happening. People are smart. So the technology and the use of AI has to get smarter for us to be able to understand where frauds can happen, where the patterns are going wrong, where some of the transactions do not sit right with the overall compliance requirements that we have. So that is where these tools become extremely helpful for us.
So any tools that you would like to mention, like what, like do you use Excel, like things like that, or Power BI
No,
for
of
presentations?
course, for us to do the analytics and review that, we use several tools. But in the market, if you were to speak generally, for example, if you're looking at payments, there are several international tools where the payment screening happen, whether the payment is being made to any sensitive countries. For example, there are sanctions, right, where to make sure that the money is not being used for, let's say, improper purposes, or sensitive countries where terrorist funding can happen. So these are mostly on the money laundering requirements. So there are tools where actually the payments organizations can pass their payments through, which will pick up exceptions. Hey, this looks like a suspicious person. Why are we paying to this person? This looks like a suspicious country. Why are we transacting with this particular country? So that's a very, very important example of a payment tool. Then we also have tools where one of the important evidence we collect during investigations are the company's email data of that particular employee, the conversations, right? Now, an employee, if he's been around for let's say 15 or 20 years, they'll have lakhs of emails and chats and so many things. Again, it is not possible to review all of those. So then there are keyword searches which are run through the tools, where they can pick up that they see here are the relevant emails which could be useful, and then some of those are reviewed for evidence. So there are multiple tools available for this. outside Excel and typical PowerPoint, where it sort of reduces the complexity of transactions or investigations for us.
Mhm. Sure. Uh, are there any ethical considerations that we considered when you're part of forensic accounting, like beyond this regular whatever the regular compliances and regular thoughts?
Yes. Okay. See, forensic leads to what kind of roles? Ethics officers, compliance officers,
Mhm.
investigation officers. So if I'm an ethics officer, I really need to have a strong set of personal ethics, and I need to make sure that I'm taking the right ethical considerations whenever I'm doing an investigations.
Mhm.
Something very important is personal integrity becomes very important. Trust me, tell me, if you yourself are corrupt, how will you investigate somebody else? And if somebody is corrupt, won't their investigation get tainted? How easy it is to influence the person who is doing the investigation. So it is important to have a very strong personal set of values, first of all. Then confidentiality is extremely important because during investigations, you talk to the whistleblower who's actually reporting the complaints. You talk to a lot of witnesses who give you confidential and sensitive data. You get access to different data sets which have to be kept very safe. So you have to maintain the confidentiality and make sure that it is not discussed or spoken outside the context of the investigations. So whatever you need to do has to be within the framework and boundaries of the investigations that you're handling. So confidentiality is important. Then data privacy. Because when we are doing investigations, you also come across personal data of people, which sometimes may be relevant, may not be relevant, right? But again, these personal data have to be kept confidential and used only for the purposes of investigations. Now, there are very stringent laws around data privacy also. There is the data protection law in India, there is GDPR guidelines in Europe. So apart from the guidelines, but I'm talking because we were talking about ethics and ethical considerations, basic human decency, but we do not misuse the data and powers we have. With great responsibility comes, with great power comes great responsibility. Spider-Man said, but yeah,
Yeah.
basically, because you tend to get access to a lot of sensitive data, people tend to talk to you, and the moment you're an investigation officer, compliance officer, right? People tend to tell you a lot of things. They actually confide in you. They actually come and tell you things which they may not tell others, right? So you have to protect their trust and be compliant with that.
Okay.
So yes, these are some of the important considerations when
Yeah.
we're talking about ethical considerations.
Yeah, I think it looks like a double-edged sword. But just to ask from other perspective, even an auditor usually will face a dilemma of ignoring certain things sometimes for different interest purpose. But my question is this: do you have any risk to consider? Risk not in terms of what you do. Like, do you get threats?
Personal risk.
Yeah, like
Personal risk.
how
Yes.
difficult for
Hmm.
you? You might find certain things, but you may not be able to report it because of its
Hmm.
consequences. So,
Hmm.
uh, have you
Hmm.
heard of it, or how does that part look like on a personal level?
Okay. See, to be honest, I'll never say there is no risk, right? Because it is a sensitive profession we are in. You are looking at wrongdoings of people, and of course, you are not making enemies exactly, but people are not happy with some of the findings you may have, right? So there can be a lot of emotional pressure when it comes to doing investigations. Now, that pressure may come as somebody may plead that, please, this is the first time I did it. I was not sure why I did it. Let me go. It can go from emotional pressure to threat tone that I don't think you should be reporting this, and just take care of yourself. Very in a very subtle manner. So, fortunately, what happens when you're in a corporate environment, these risks are much lower because you also have the backing of your management, you have the compliance team, you have guidelines to follow, and somewhere employees understand that it is not really personal between the compliance officer and the person, right? But no, it is never that there is zero risk. The employees can still have vendetta against the person who did investigation, who did findings. Because when we're doing interrogations and interviews, sometimes you ask hard questions,
Yeah,
you
you
ask
have to.
difficult
Yes.
questions. You have to ask, right?
Yes.
That's the profession we are in. So
Yes.
they can take it the wrong way and they can have grudge against you. But yes, in a corporate environment, people are definitely a little more protected versus, let's say, a public investigation when there are, let's say, large companies involved or other players involved. See, of course, we have seen in cases of authorities, police, or investigators being threatened all the time that don't do this, otherwise, there'll be other threats. But at least for us, the risks are minimized because there are certain set of guidelines and you work for a corporate. But yeah, life is interesting. There are some risks sometimes, and you take it into account while you're doing the reviews and investigations. And you always try and put it across that look, this is not my personal investigation. I have nothing against you. These are the company rules. Like you, I'm also an employee here, and we are just trying to make sure that we all follow the compliance guidelines of the company.
Sure. So, I just have few basic questions.
Mm-hmm.
I know that I think you also have done chartered forensic accounting course, as CFE as we call it. I think you also have done it. So you have answered earlier, but you can also do it in an overview manner. How can a CA become take this as profession? Does he have to do CFE? And
Mm-hmm.
what a student when he is pursuing CA final or CA inter can do, or if you don't complete CA, you're just inter or you have not cleared
Mm-hmm.
one group, what are the opportunities that person can pursue in this career? You can just give an overview. How does it look like?
Okay. Okay. At a very, very basic starting off level, right? So today, even commerce graduates from some of the elite colleges are being hired in forensic teams at an analyst role.
Mhm.
So what I'm trying to say is that anybody with a strong finance acumen and interest in commerce and interest in investigations is a good candidate. There are other soft skills like attention to details, having like strong personal ethics, and the interest in investigations. Those are very important. But from an academic qualification purpose, even commerce graduates are being hired from elite colleges. Of course, it is still limited.
Mhm. Mhm.
So now coming to a chartered accountancy course, yes, CA freshers, definitely to start with, you do not need any fancy certifications. You do not need any multiple degrees. If
Okay.
you once you complete your course, you have your articleship in place. That can be with a big four, with a non-big four, even that would not strongly matter. But yes, if it is with certain mid-sized firms or you've done it in internal audit and process reviews, it may give you a slight edge because forensic is an extension of in some way, not exactly, but good understanding of processes and good understanding of risks are very important. So if you have done a consulting role or an internal audit role, and having multiple exposures is of course always important. From there, starting a career in forensic is not very difficult. As years go, you can always add additional qualifications. Now, globally, there is certified fraud examiner, which is given by the ACFE Institute, which is based in the US. This is an online certification. The course can be completed online and you receive a certification. So these are all add-ons. I would never say these are foundationally required, fundamentally required. So being a CA, or you said, sometimes it may not be possible for somebody to complete their CA, right? Even if you're a CA inter or you have experience in this field, and after that you would like to pursue, you can still pursue the opportunities. So as long as you have a financial interest and background and interest to do forensics, and you can showcase that why is this important to you, you are still a good candidate. There are still good chances. But as you grow, certainly over the years, there are certain additional things which you can do. For example, like you mentioned, CFE, right? CFE is one aspect.
Okay.
Then for somebody who's interested to become a compliance professional, that is,
Mhm.
compliance is not only forensic audits, but also more proactive measures to make sure that there are, you work as a compliance officer. There is a CCEP certification, which is a certified compliance and ethics professional. And typically over many years, I said earlier, right, forensic has overlap between, let's say, a CA profession as well as a legal profession. You looking into legal expertise is also important because when you take the route of legal and corporate investigations, maybe a law degree or certain specialization in some of the topics of laws becomes very important. So they can also become a quasi, let's say, an accountant, quasi legal professional. But these are all very advanced in my. To be honest, to start off, a strong finance background, ability to understand financial statements, books of accounts, a keen interest to become a forensic professional, and strong communication, improve communication, which is very important, and an interest in forensics. These are really
There are
important.
no courses, certificate courses where some people can say, do 30 days course and you can do something. There are no such things in existence, which you can,
Uh,
any of
I
those,
mean,
that
see,
sort.
in today's world, you go online, you search for any course, anybody can teach you anything, right? You will
Correct.
find hundreds and hundreds of courses on anything. They're all again add on. I'm saying being a CA, being a strongly fundamental in your basics is very important. That is more than enough. In fact, if you ask me to continue as a forensic audit professional, even, I mean, of course, based on interest, people can study and take additional certification. CFE is definitely a good add-on, but even a basic degree is more than enough for you to pursue, because you always pick up skills on the job. You can continuous learning is never discouraged, but I'm saying all these are additional.
That is
No,
okay.
all these are add-ons. The
They're not
basic is
essentials
never
to,
in your basic.
they're not
Exactly.
qualifications or no,
They're
filter
not
criterias.
qualifications.
Okay.
Yes. Like a non-CA can still do CFE. Nothing stops them from that. But since
Mhm.
we are talking about this career, I'm saying being in this plan, having done the basics foundations and having done the articleship, which is more than sufficient for somebody to grow as a forensic professional.
Okay, great. So just to sum it up, how how do you think about this career? Because you joined thinking you wanted to join, you have seen, more than a decade now. So how do you see yourself now and yourself and position, overall summary from your point of view?
Okay. Okay. See, the career is very interesting. You know, every day, so many days, sometimes days are way too interesting because so many things happen and you're looking at issues and you're dealing with multiple things. But there are also extremely difficult days because sometimes you're poring over so much data, you're trying to understand, nothing sensible is coming out. And you're like, what am I doing in this profession? Why do I need to do this? I'm not finding evidence. So it can be frustrating many times. So it has been quite a journey, but overall it's been a very thoroughly interesting journey because you get to interact with so many kinds of people, so many kinds of issues, and find evidences and build on that. But it does not mean that there are not hard work, there are not grunt work. A lot of that also happens here. So if you're okay that some days there are setbacks and frustrations that I'm not getting anywhere, where do I go with this? I'm neither able to prove something nor able to disprove something, and you're stuck in the limbo for a while. But otherwise, definitely my journey has been very interesting. I've interacted with different kind of people, come across with different kinds of explanations and stories. Sometimes when you're interviewing people, the stories keep changing. They say something and they're like, no, 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 I didn't mean it that way. This is what I meant. You are understanding like me incorrectly. So you meet a lot of interesting personalities as well. So life's quite interesting. There are like difficult days and good days like any other profession, but I've absolutely enjoyed being a forensic and compliance professional like all these years.
Sure. Maybe I think on that note, we'll conclude this session. Thank you so much for giving time, because that is one thing, if we give it to somebody else, we cannot take it back in our life, and that is time. And as part of the initiative towards supporting our students and CAs on different career path a CA can take, this was one of the sessions. I hope this was useful. You can look up for many more things. And if you have anything in your mind, please let me know. I'll try to arrange for the same. I hope your time is well spent. Thank you for taking time, and thank you, Priyanka, for giving the time and sharing the experiences. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chinmay. It was a pleasure being here, and all the best to all the students. And remember, you can always follow any career path, and there are no limitations to what you can do. So, introspect yourselves and see what is that you want to do. And today, in today's world, there are so many options. So, all the best with that, and I'm sure all of you will have a great career ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chinmay.